All right. Good morning, folks. We're going to launch in. Thank you for showing up at 9 a.m. on day 3 of this conference after what I'm sure was a slew of activities last night. So we appreciate you being here this morning. My name is Christine Williams. I'm a program director with Enterprise Community Partners. If you're not familiar with Enterprise, we're a nationwide nonprofit organization, do a lot of programmatic policy work around affordable housing. I work out of our Northern California market, and I am based in Stockton, so it's good to be with all of you this morning. So today we're going to be talking about regional migration, and certainly in Stockton, but maybe where all of you are from as well, there's been a lot of sort of dialogue and discussion around this topic of migration, right? So where households are moving and why. And if you attended many of yesterday's sessions and some of the plenary discussions, you also heard that where people live matters from a variety of perspectives, right? So where people live determines how far they need to commute for work. It might even determine how they commute to work. Do they have viable transportation options? Do they need to have or own or rent a car? Where people live determines the types of amenities they have access to, right? So school quality, healthcare, food access, jobs. And where people live is increasingly being driven by what they can afford. So moving to where you can afford to rent or own a home, and then what sort of trade-offs are you making in order to be able to afford that housing? So household displacement, which we're also going to talk a little bit about today, and can cause some of this migration that we're seeing across the state, also looks different depending on the type of community you're in. So are you what I've heard termed a receiving community? Are you receiving households being pushed out of higher cost regions? Are you in a higher cost region and you're seeing loss of households? Those dynamics differ, right? And so again, I live in Stockton, and there's been a lot of dialogue around an emerging narrative and this perception that as people are leaving higher cost regions like the Bay Area or like Sacramento, and they're coming into places like the San Joaquin Valley, how is that impacting housing costs where I live and for my community? And what is sort of the interrelatedness of those housing costs in this sort of region, and things like commuting and employment, which we know, again, don't just live sort of within this local bubble, but is interdependent across multiple localities. So as part of this conversation today, our panelists are also going to talk about this concept of the mega region. And if you're not familiar, there's some dialogue emerging around the Northern California mega region. And so again, that's looking at the Bay Area, the Sacramento region, and the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley, and kind of the flows of people and information and money that moves around within this system. So we'll be sharing some work being done under that mega region umbrella with you this morning. Our panel's also going to share some of the research currently being undertaken around migration in Northern California. We'll talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities that this movement of households is presenting, and how specifically public agencies can actively prepare for neighborhood change. And we're gonna explore some strategies that are being supported kind of at a funder level to help ensure that our communities are prepared for these migration shifts and their associated impacts. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel very quickly here. We have Bernadette Austin. She's the director of UC Davis's Center for Regional Change. And CRC has really been helping lead efforts around migration research in California, especially again, as it relates to this mega region concept. We have Christina Corrales. She's a senior planner with the San Joaquin Council of Governments. You'll hear me call that SJCOG. And SJCOG has just concluded, along with Enterprise, a displacement assessment for San Joaquin County, where we were considering public investment and the associated household displacement risk that can have. So COG is really trying to be proactive and being good stewards of the investment they're putting into their community and making sure they're mitigating displacement impacts as it relates to that investment. They're also an ongoing member in the mega region work. And then we have Michelle Kai. She's a manager at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative within their Housing Sustainability Unit. And CZI has really been working very intentionally to help support housing advocacy partners, especially within the San Joaquin Valley, both to increase their local capacity, but also to help these communities develop important assets and infrastructure opportunities that promotes overall neighborhood stability. And so before I hand the mic over to our panel, we're gonna get started with some framing questions that I want us all to consider. So thinking about your own story and your own ability to sort of choose and have agency with where you live. So if you are familiar or not familiar, we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter, which is up here on the screen. And in order to access the questions we'll be looking at, you can either go to menti.com and enter in that code, or you can scan this QR code and it will take you there automatically. And just kind of, I guess, I'll wait for the phones to go down to sort of indicate whether you were able to get on there. And you're just gonna see a little screen at the start, no questions yet. Still see some phones up, so we'll give it a moment. All right, I see Michael and Robert in the back with their phone up, so we'll keep waiting. All right, we ready for me to move to the first question here? Still see phones, I'll give it another moment. All right, first question. When you're kind of thinking about migration and movement, just curious about where all of you are from and sort of the change you might have seen in where you live now. And for example, I was born in Riverside, California, but as I mentioned, now live in Stockton. So I'm kind of sticking close to the inland California. And it actually occurs to me that I can't, oh, here we go. It's populating, cool. I can't see it on my end. So let's see here. We've got, someone born in Taipei, now living in Rockland. Some movement along the coast there, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, Stockton. Let's see, I can't get down on the screen here. Nope. All right. So you can see a lot of folks not actually winding up where they originated from, right? So there's an interesting takeaway there. We're going to go ahead to the next question. So thinking about how far you live from your place of work. And so the question up here is, if you were to commute to your place of work by any mode, how far are you traveling to get there? So we have a couple options up here on screen. You can see it moving around there. I will note, and Christine, correct me, I think a commute over 50 miles is considered a mega commute. So I know I fortunately am able to work from home, but if I didn't, my home office is in San Francisco, which is quite a trek from Stockton. Okay, we got a lot of folks in that second category, 10 to 50 miles, but a couple super commuters in there if you had to hop on over to your office. Next question. Median rent for a 2-bedroom in California currently stands at just over $2,200. So curious about whether folks in the room feel like that's something they could afford. Maybe you could afford it, but it might make you housing insecure in other ways. Okay, we got a mix here. All right, housing industry pays fairly well. We can get that median rent. All right, how about the median price of a home, which stands immediate no. And if you're thinking about that in terms of monthly payment, if you have a standard 30-year fixed loan and the current going interest rate, you would be paying just under $4,000 a month for that mortgage. Okay, a couple options here. I could not, so I'm solidly in that no category. And I just, I put these up here to sort of think about the choices we really have in determining where we live. Can you afford that commute? Can you manage that commute? Can you afford your housing? Is it near the amenities and the resources you need? And if it isn't, as it isn't for so many of us in California, what does that mean in terms of your opportunities to leave, to go somewhere else? And just kind of wanted to get us thinking about that before I turn it over to our panel. And so first up, it's gonna be Bernadette here with Center for Regional Change, and I'm gonna bring your, show up. You got your little guy here. All right, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us this morning. I know that I personally did not get home till 11 p.m. last night, but I am about as perky as it gets, so thank you all for being here. You've been warned. They put the most energetic speaker first. I work for UC Davis, and we do research that really we hope can inform people who are making decisions and making plans like yourselves. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be offering a couple of, here's a clicker. I'll be offering a couple of QR codes. I would encourage you, because I wanted to provide some tools of tools that we've helped develop or developed directly. So just scan that, and then you can kind of save that website for future reference. I will tell you, the websites I'm sharing with you are not great for viewing on your phone because they're very dense, but they're a really great resource, and you can just kind of tag them for future reference. Let's see, that doesn't seem to work. Let's try this. That doesn't seem to work. Let's try this. There we go. Okay, excellent. And let's see if I can reveal that for you. So just a little bit about our research center. Again, we try to do work that is applied. We work in partnership with organizations such as these. So of course with philanthropies, local governments, regional governments, private sector, public sector. So please feel free to reach out to organizations like ours because research can be your partner. So what I'd like to do is share with the national audience a couple of concepts, but you as Californians can also benefit from some of these. So we are geographically twice as large as New England, and people don't understand, like this is a very, very large geography, and we have many million more residents than Texas. I also share with folks, and this might be useful for you in some of the work that you do, that California's housing crisis is creating a crisis of equity in other states. I see heads nodding. So when we talk amongst ourselves, we are here for Housing California, but there are national implications for some of the challenges that we are facing. Why? Because people are displaced. And I'll say one other thing about out-of-state displacement. My research is really focused on displacement and housing and transportation implications within California, and particularly with a mega region focus that we'll be talking about in a moment. But again, around this, what we have found, what the Public Policy Institute of California found in 2021 was that the people who are migrating out of state tend to be more people of color, tend to be more people who don't have a bachelor's degree or more, tend to be folks who are lower income. And the folks who are moving into California, so even though we don't have a major net out migration, the people moving into California tend to be coming for higher wage paying jobs. They tend to have college educations or more. So when we talk about displacement, we really need to think about the implications of who is being essentially forced out. So this is data that you've probably already seen or at least know about. I'll highlight a couple things. We just looked at this data. This is average. And we absolutely know that there are great discrepancies within our state. I'll highlight that minimum wage. This actually data is a little bit dated, that you will have to work more than 90 hours a week to afford to pay rent for the metric shown here when you're making minimum wage. Going to the next slide. So this data is looking at 3-bedroom rents, but it's a good data point. So what I talked about is we look at the average costs. Here, let me read it because I don't think you're gonna be able to see what we're talking about here. If you look at the red areas in the Bay Area, those are the highest cost of living areas. The green areas throughout more of the kind of inland areas of the state are some of the lower cost areas. To orient you, we are looking at some of the highest rents, like $4,000 a month, in counties directly adjacent to places where the average rent is under $2,000 a month. So when you have that great discrepancy, the pressures for migration are even stronger. The analogy I share with folks is the US-Mexico border is one of the only places in the world where you have a developed and a developing country that share a border. This is a very similar migration pattern where it makes logical sense for you to live in a place 1 county or 2 counties over from your employer or where you previously lived because the cost of living was so high. So, oh look, QR codes. I will also have a QR code for each of these tools on the first slide of these sections. So don't feel like, oh no, she skipped it. I'll just highlight some of these tools. So here are 4 tools. I'm gonna spend the most time talking about the first one in black, the gentrification and displacement assessment for San Joaquin County. That's really the focus of what we're talking about. But I think there's 3 other studies I think that would be helpful for folks who are attending. One, the blue one, is we've done an assessment of statewide inclusionary programs in partnership with the California Coalition for Rural Housing. Another database is the yellow one, the general plan database. We've collected all of the general plans and analyze them with AI and machine learning and have some really amazing things to share. Spoiler alert, if you are with a local or regional government, please feel free to contact me. We're gonna be doing some outreach to find out how this tool can be more useful to local government. Then the last is the orange one. Again, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about, this is not a data tool, but I will be summarizing some of the findings that we have. We're about 2/3 through a 3-year research study, so I'll be sharing a bit more about that. And as promised, I will go to the first slide. So this is the only time you'll get to see the migration study QR code, so please snap your picture if you haven't yet. So this migration study is qualitative research and quantitative. So we're working with partners at USC and Occidental, gathering tons of data from all sorts of resources. And we're really trying to look at what are the implications for this mega region migration. One thing that we found was that the nomenclature of this research study actually became obsolete while we were doing it. It isn't really Bay Area to Central Valley. We really looked at some of the implication for Sierra foothills. But the point is, these high-cost areas are really pushing on these lower, they're not even low-cost areas anymore, but lower housing cost areas. And I'm gonna share a slide that's gonna give you a headache, but it's okay. You can go to the site that you've just downloaded or taken a picture of and get more information. So just highlighting a couple of some pieces here. Between 1994 and 2015, 500,000 households moved to the Central Valley from the Bay Area. Does anyone remember 2015? That was a lifetime ago. That was pre-Trump, okay? That's a lifetime ago. That was pre-pandemic. So think about what some of the implications are for how much more migration. Spoiler alert, there's been a lot more migration, but this is the data that's currently available from this particular data source. I will note that over 300,000 made the reverse move. They moved from the Central Valley to the Bay Area. That's still a net migration of 200,000. Often, another piece of information that was very interesting is the next further out. So we found that people tended to move along transit corridors, or transportation corridors, I should say. So people didn't just move from San Francisco to Reno. Like, that was not a common move. They would move along the Highway 80 corridor. They would move along the Amtrak corridor. They'll move along the Altamont Pass corridor. So you would move from you or subsequent related households, your adult children, for example. So maybe someone grew up in San Francisco, they moved to Oakland. Their kids moved from Oakland to Vacaville. Folks from Vacaville would move to Sacramento. So even within the same household or the same generation, they would move along transportation corridors. For those of you who are working exclusively in housing, think about the partnerships with your transportation partners, because there's pretty significant implications for that. And guess what? Spoiler alert, COGs are intimately part of that transportation housing nexus. Destinations varied by income. So this map that's giving you a headache, we have, again, a lot more details, but where people would move mattered. So people wouldn't move from a low-income neighborhood in or home in the Bay Area to, for example, Roseville in Sacramento. They would move to Sacramento or South Sacramento, where there were lower rents. So similarly, we saw that lower-income households were moving to places like Stockton, Los Banos, and Patterson, and higher-income households would move to Folsom, Roseville, and Tracy. Another important implication, people aren't only being displaced, they are moving by choice. We also need to think about the implications for those receiving communities, such as Tracy. Let's see, another piece to highlight. Move patterns have been very stable over time. This is important because when we were doing some of this research, some of the representatives from receiving communities, particularly advocates, said, this has been a problem for generations. We're looking at data back to 1994. There may be people in this room who weren't even born in 1994. So just know that we are in our second and third generation of movement. So similar to when people are making international migration, which generation you are moving into a community does have some implications. And then let's see here. And then I think the last piece I'll highlight is with the pandemic, data that we got from the US Postal Service showed that showed further moves from dense Bay Area zip codes to suburban and ex-urban locations in Sacramento suburbs, Sierra foothills, and San Joaquin County. So that's generally where people are moving. There's also this misconception that everybody's moving out of state, and that's, again, it's almost a net zero move, but it's important to think as I've mentioned earlier, who is moving? Okay, so I spent a lot of time on that slide. I'll spend a little less time on some of the other slides. So we have this general plan database. Won't spend a lot of time here, so if you want to take a minute to take a picture of this particular QR code. So this is structured as an interactive map, but you can actually download the general plans or certain chapters. Let's say you only want to work on your housing element, for example, and see what comparably sized jurisdictions are doing, or jurisdictions in your area. So this has been really useful. Just to share with you a little bit of information about the kinds of things we're finding that because the housing element is required to be updated, it evolves quicker than other aspects of the general plan. So if you're making all these housing plans, but you are not updating your mobility, or you're not updating your safety sections, wildfire and housing planning are evolving at different speeds. We are not addressing that. So just thinking about pieces like that. Also, I don't remember the exact number, but we have a single-digit number of, over 500 general plans that mention race. So think about when you're having conversations around race equity, talking with those organizations that are looking at updating the general plan, are we addressing some of the key equity issues? So I'm going to spend the most time, I think, on a little more time on this particular slide, which is the gentrification and displacement tool. This will take you to SJCOG's website. So if for some reason you're like, I don't know, this lady was talking really fast and I didn't take a picture of the QR code, you can go to SJCOG's website and be able to find this. So the comprehensive study that the CRC did with Enterprise and in partnership with SJCOG can be found here. So I'll talk a little bit about just some of the highlights. I see a couple of cameras, nicely done. Okay, so just 3 pretty simple summaries of what the mapping tool tells us. The importance of selecting the right indicators. So we actually looked at some templates for other displacement tools. One that we adapted the most directly from was an urban displacement tool, which has been used in communities like the Bay Area and Sacramento. But what we need to measure in communities that are suburban and are changing at a different rate, you need to look at different indicators. I'm not going to get into those. You can go to the website and learn more. Also, the disconnection between displacement risk and race. So anecdotally, if you're working in this field, you know that people of color are being displaced at higher rates. However, if you're trying to make a case to your elected officials that we need to factor in race, not just because it's trendy, but because there's actual data to support it, this can hopefully be a good tool, and that we really hope that that's how it's going to be used in San Joaquin County. And then the third is a relationship between displacement risk and rent-related evictions. So a lot to say about that, but I'll just keep moving on. So how could stakeholders use this tool? Here are just 2 examples. Local government could use this tool to inform their housing element development. And we also really hope that they can use this in affirmatively furthering fair housing. Housing organizations, so affordable housing developers, housing advocates could potentially use this information to develop a renter protection strategy. What are those areas at highest displacement risk by census tract, so we can really, really focus on that particular tract or zip code. I'm only going to show a couple of slides so we don't do a deep dive into the data, but I will highlight this is what it basically looks like. And we look at the areas that are orange, which have varying levels of risk of gentrification, and the purple and blue areas are the areas we really want to concentrate on and think about. I will note that some of the areas which are marked in gray on our website indicate areas that kind of lie outside the data set, so places where there's a high student or prison population. And I'll just highlight a couple of places that, the ways that it would look. So this is actually what a screenshot from that particular site looks like. You can select, I believe, up to 3 screens. And this particular screen I've chosen to highlight for a couple of reasons. One is because you can see the 2 side by side. The other, so you can see the different color schemes. But if you probably can't see it, but the green, so the one on the right with the sort of blue and tan coloring, that's the displacement risk, so a comprehensive analysis of the different metrics. On the right is proportions of people of color. And again, we're in California, so we're not looking at, over 50%. So we're comparing places like 60% people of color, 80% people of color. And if you look, you can kind of see this inverse relation between people of color and displacement risk. This is the kind of data that you can share to build your case on why race needs to be included in some of your work. You can also click on the census tract and get a lot more information. Again, it's super small on this screen, but it can be useful for you, again, when you're doing more neighborhood level planning. As I mentioned, you can kind of have a couple of screens. Now, you can also overlay other data sets. So when we worked with community partners, one thing that they really wanted to look at was rental eviction rates. So you can start gathering some of this data to look at displacement risk and other data sets. And what's great is it's so much information, but if you show a map to a community member or decision maker, they don't need to have a background in statistics to really viscerally understand what this data is saying. So it is compelling, it's also much more accessible. I'll just highlight, we are around two other things. So the inclusionary housing database, what we hope is that this can be a tool that can be used for examining how to create or improve inclusionary databases, advocate for or create them within your jurisdictions. So we have seen that there's at least 2 inclusionary programs in each of these regions. I'm gonna be honest, that's not super impressive. The good news is you can build a case that other people with similar communities can do inclusionary housing. We can too. 16 out of the 58 counties have an inclusionary housing program, and a similar proportion, so roughly a little more than a quarter of cities also have an inclusionary housing program. Again, I feel like we can see some really good improvement there, but there should be enough comparables for you to share with decision makers and advocate. So this is what that database looks like. We have tracked 150 programs. Again, you can see a lot of data. On the left side of your screen, you can see the filters, and then the right side are pop-ups. So right now, it's just cities alphabetized, and you can actually click on those individual cities. I'm doing a quick zoom into Contra Costa County for a couple of reasons. One, because you see both city and county ones. The county programs are highlighted in green, and the city programs are highlighted in purple. That deeper purple means there's more than one type of inclusionary program. Also something really interesting to look at. And then you can click and do a much deeper dive into exactly what's in and search by what's in those particular programs. So are they targeting by a certain median income? So that's like a lot of information, but I'll also say, please feel free to reach out to me on any of these programs, and I encourage you to check out these websites because they are full of information. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Bernadette. We're going to do questions at the end, so if you have some, log them. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Christina Corrales' presentation.
All right, cool. So good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Corrales. I'm a senior planner with the San Joaquin Council of Governments, and my role there is as a staff lead on our regional housing work, as well as our climate resiliency work and our clean mobility projects. So I'm spread thin, but this is one of the projects that I've been really proud of over the last couple of years, and so happy that we recently completed it. And so my colleague Bernadette touched on the geographic context of the Northern California mega region. And so in addition to this migration pattern that we're observing across these mega regions in Northern California, I'll just add that over a similar time frame that Bernadette talked about the migration patterns, SJCOG has also observed the increasing volumes of super commuters, so those traveling more than 50 miles one way to their place of work over that same time frame. And just to give you a little bit more context, this is pre-pandemic numbers, so disclaimer there, but 90,000 workers commute over the hill daily commute out of the county daily, but 80% of those trips are actually going from San Joaquin County over the hill into the Bay Area. And so that just kind of gives you a sense of like where the connection is, where the linkages are between our economies here in San Joaquin County and then in the Bay Area. So this really creates a transportation infrastructure challenge, and it has to be addressed through SJCOG's regional transportation planning and programming efforts, and programming meaning like SJCOG is the funding agency for a lot of regionally significant projects. So in this context of regional migration and commuting patterns, they're crossing traditional jurisdictional boundaries. in the Northern California area. And so this morning, I'll just be talking a little bit about how SJCOG is working with neighboring regions, regional agencies, specifically to team up on coordinating for planning, programming, and advocacy at the mega-regional level, and then sharing a bit more about the impetus behind the project that Bernadette just provided you all a little bit of a peek into the data. So let's see, does this, no?
I managed to get it to work, but or arrow.
Or not, okay. No? Space?
Pardon us.
Sorry. Page down?
You're on mute.
My esteemed friend can.
Nope, nope.
No. It's moving on here.
Sorry about that, folks. So I'll just, oh, there we go. Yeah. I'll start with, what is the San Joaquin Council of Governments? I don't know that everyone's familiar, and I'll just bring you into the world of transportation planning for just a few minutes. SJCOG is a metropolitan planning organization. We're a regional transportation planning agency, and we're a local transportation sales tax authority. These are multiple roles that SJCOG plays in the San Joaquin region, and so historically, we've primarily focused our planning efforts around transportation. And so, in addition to all these roles, SJCOG is also a council of governments. It's a joint powers authority. It's governed by a board of directors with representatives from all of the cities, the county, board of supervisors, non-voting members from Caltrans, the regional transit district, and the port of Stockton. And SJCOG's mission is actually much broader than transportation. It includes regional and interregional issues that may benefit from partnering with local governments, private sector, community groups, and key stakeholders to develop solutions. So next slide. And so to date, SJCOG's role in housing has primarily focused on 3 areas. Regional housing needs allocation process, which we conduct every 8 years, and we're currently undergoing an update right now. Providing technical assistance for especially for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, AHSC, and more broadly as a convener and facilitator on issues related to housing. But recently in 2020, the SJCOG board actually approved a set of regional housing priorities, which include feasibility planning for a regional housing trust, supporting streamlining activities at the local level for development processes, and then improving regional housing and planning coordination. And these priorities are funded with SJCOG's regional early action planning funds. And so I'll bring us back to this Northern California mega region conversation. So in recognition of the functional geographic scale for many labor, transportation, housing, land use, natural, economic, and other systems, it's not really possible for one MPO or one regional agency to fully plan for the future of its residents without considering what's happening across the border in the neighboring region. And so we're kind of crossing borders. We're breaking the silos a little bit by creating this mega region working group, which was formed intentionally to establish a joint commitment from the leaders in the region, the mega region, for planning, for infrastructure, transportation prioritization, and for state and federal kind of policy advocacy. And so who are the member agencies? We've got the Metropolitan Planning Commission that serves the Bay Area, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, and then the San Joaquin Council of Governments. Next slide. And so this is a coalition that's made up of 12 members. So each of the member MPO agencies has four reps from their boards that serve on this working group. So the working group spans 16 counties, 136 cities, and a total population of 11 million people across those 3 regions. And So the mega region working group developed a legislative platform to advocate for shared policy positions, and on the screen are just kind of like highlights of what's on that platform. And you'll notice, from supporting more funding for affordable housing to facilitating construction of more housing, working on that jobs and housing balance between the Bay Area and San Joaquin County. That's also a big priority for this group, as well as supporting better transit and connectivity, including high-speed internet between the regions. In addition to that, more recently in 2021, the working group actually developed or adopted something they're calling the Mega Region Dozen. So these are 12 infrastructure, like transportation projects that the working group together put on a platform to prioritize for funding, to bring to their lobby days at the federal government or at the state, to really push projects that improve quality of life, that improve commerce and people movement across the mega region. And so this list really emphasizes some important passenger rail connections, as well as highway improvements between the Sacramento area, the Bay Area, and San Joaquin County. So in addition to these kind of 12 projects, the Mega Region Group is also starting to consider issues that intersect with transportation. So housing and climate, environment and economy are all part of their discussions around transportation infrastructure. And one example of this is, especially at the staff level, there's a lot more exchange of information and coordination around improving our RENA methodology, for example, talking about what we're doing to develop equitable transportation project development and other kind of key areas that all the regions are working on. And so all that brings us back to our displacement risk study. So if regional migration trends aren't enough, or super commuter patterns, or transportation infrastructure plans, especially around transit, aren't enough, these are 3 reasons for thinking about displacement risk in the San Joaquin region. But we didn't just arrive at this conclusion overnight, and so I'll kind of explain how we got here. In 2016, SJCOG started providing technical assistance for the AHSC program, and I think this really started to build a relationship with housing developers in the region, and kind of really started to introduce staff to what are some of the challenges in developing housing in the region. In 2017, SJCOG also joined the Reinvent South Stockton Coalition as a convener for their neighborhood transformation working group, and this group really focused on housing issues in San Joaquin County, especially in Stockton. And so it really deepened SJCOG staff knowledge about what the needs are and the urgency is for developing solutions. In 2018, we heard directly from a lot of the stakeholders in our regional transportation planning update process around concerns about gentrification and displacement in the region. But what we found as staff is that there was really a lack of information locally to understand the issue. And that led to, in 2019, developing and scoping this displacement risk project and partnering with UC Davis and Enterprise on developing this mapping tool. And then here we are in 2020 with the project just completed and kind of looking towards next steps and opportunities with REAP 1 and REAP 2 dollars. So Bernadette talked about some of the key takeaways from the displacement assessment. Some of the things that I'm highlighting to our board actually is, that the data kind of speaks for itself, and it points to the fact that San Joaquin County is not immune to displacement risk. I think that was something of a debate before we did this study, and I think that the data kind of speaks for itself at this point. And so after doing this exercise, what we found is that a majority of the census tracts are experiencing varying levels of exclusiveness, that, and about 20% of the census tracts are at high displacement risk or actively in the gentrification process. So it really kind of provides the context and the urgency for our decision makers to take action. And so in addition to the mapping tool, we've also created a policy toolkit for our local jurisdictions. And this provides a menu of policies and case studies for them to take a look at and consider implementation. And I'll put the note, like the asterisk consider, because it's a toolkit for our local jurisdictions, and it'll ultimately be up to them to implement the policy. And so I'll say that there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll reserve that for Michelle in her presentation. And then the last thing about the study is that it provided some recommendations for SJCOG to implement or integrate into its regional planning work. Some of that includes establishing, a regular working group with folks who focus on housing and land use issues. Includes developing some sort of internal equitable development guidelines for our projects and planning. It includes implementing some sort of programming to support infrastructure and housing development. These are all issues that have been highlighted by local agencies and developers as a dire need for funding. And then the last piece is, what can we do to incentivize the jurisdictions that are meeting housing goals? And so SJCOG is looking at these recommendations a little bit more intentionally as we plan for and prepare for our REAP 2 program. And so I think the research has really been helpful to inform SJCOG's work moving forward. And so I will stop there and say thank you, and there's my contact information if you would like any more info.
Okay, now I'm gonna turn it over to Michelle. See if our clicker wants to work.
I will try to keep the clicker hot.
Hi, Cam.
Oh, there it goes. Okay. Awesome. Magic. Thanks, sweet. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today at the Housing California Conference, and it's a really big honor for me to be on this panel with Bernadette and the Christines.
And the Christines. That's our band name.
Yeah, look out for us coming locally. So I am really excited to talk to you all about what's happening locally in the San Joaquin County area. I know we're all here gathered today to talk about statewide work, and a lot of the kind of dynamics are happening statewide, but a lot of the improvements and the day-to-day really come down to what's happening locally and regionally. So really excited to share more about that. I am from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and we have a housing affordability program that started in 2016 with really the vision that everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. And that zip code should kind of determine your destiny. We know that that's really not a reality right now. There are decades of discriminatory planning practices, real estate and construction kind of policies that have led to a lot of inequitable outcomes for many marginalized communities. The good news is that there are a lot of solutions and a lot of really great, brilliant people and organizations that work towards those solutions. So we really see our role as funders in supporting the capacity and the partnerships of those great folks. So really CZI's program in housing works to strengthen and unite a lot of these folks on the front lines, doing grassroots work kind of statewide. And we kind of have the framework of the 3 Ps a lot of folks here know: production, preservation, and protection. We also see some 3 strategic pillars, which we call, and that's also in 3, so we like a lot of 3s here. The first is generating sustainable supply. So that's really around helping to build more housing that's inclusive of all incomes, not just those at the top. And a lot of that has to do with some innovation that needs to happen. So lowering costs, making sure that there are more units kind of all around. Not by itself, though, we also need to ensure equal access. So how do we unequally invest in marginalized communities and ensure that there are core tenant protections in place and where appropriate, where there haven't been before, wealth building strategies. And the third kind of pillar is building public and political will. So how do we support advocates and organizers on the ground to make sure that we're amplifying those who are impacted and helping to bridge and unite unlikely allies for that. So that's kind of us at a statewide level. I'm really excited to be here to talk about what's happening locally and specifically in the Stockton area with all of these folks here. Because with all of this happening statewide and with our big goal to help rebuild the housing system, we need to first focus on centering impacted leaders and those who are working locally to make sure that it's an equitable process and that it's sustainable in the long term. So in the next few slides, I really want to highlight what folks are working on and what our partners are working on locally to make all of that happen. The first one is the Stockton Housing Justice Coalition. And I'll just bring up a couple highlights because it really shows the kind of impact that they're making. The mission for this group is to empower Stocktonians to advocate for policies, solutions that protect tenants and promote affordable housing through skill building, education, organizing, and storytelling. And so this group only launched in 2021 last year as a coalition of residents and 10 existing CBOs that already were working locally. And their mission really involved making sure that all of the development and advocacy happening was locally led. And so things that they've done include helping to ensure that the ERAP dollars that were coming in the last couple of years went towards anti-displacement measures, that resources were there for safe camping and parking for unsheltered communities, and they helped to advocate for 2 successful Project Home Key applications. They also helped to pave the way for right to counsel policies down the road with securing over $500,000 for local direct service organizations. And then what was really exciting as well is they also did some narrative work, which is a big theme of this conference this year, and uplifted with youth leaders interviewing residents like Brenda here, who is a senior collecting SSI income and is 74 years old and had to choose between keeping up with her rent payments and taking sleeping medication to get a good night's rest. And that shouldn't really be a choice that anyone has to make, but it is certainly the reality of a lot of what's happening on the ground with connection to some of the research that Bernadette was sharing about gentrification and displacement and all of the migration pressures. It really kind of highlights the shared humanity that we all have and connects us to why this matters in the long run. The next organization that I want to share about is the embersproject. And so their mission is dedicated to community wealth building and creating collaborative forums for community engagement, planning, and resource allocation. This group taught me a lot personally because we came in with the idea of wanting to support Stocktonians with a way to do community development that was sustainable. And we had the idea and worked with a lot of local partners to think about, well, what if we create a CDC or a CBO to help kind of build long-term infrastructure for this? So we created a program and worked alongside local partners and really wanted to focus and center on the residents. And after starting those conversations, it really kind of helped us pump the brakes a little bit and understand, let's make sure that we're going into this with the right direction and making sure that we're assessing all of the strengths and appropriate resources that we have on the ground to make sure that this happens and is sustainable in the long term. So what this looked like was 21 community meetings, 18 Stockton residents on the community action team, 8 development priorities identified, and now 3.9 million secured for local nonprofits to continue the work over the next 2 years. And we still got to the same place. We have a really exciting idea for how to make this long-term, but now it's in such a better place because we ensured that there was residents' participation and kind of accountability and ownership from the beginning. And then the last one, which is the most recent, it's actually launching later this year in partnership with the Community Foundation of San Joaquin, is the Housing Innovation Fund. So the idea here is to invest in nonprofit organizations seeking to develop innovative ways to improve equal access to local housing and promote production of local housing units. So with all of these priorities and with all of these great assets kind of identified, how do we make this happen and how do we implement it? And we're really excited about this one in particular because the fund is going to be participatory in nature. So making sure that from the get-go, from the design, that their governance structure and the transparency ensures that residents who are impacted are in control of what happens. And this very pretty, but also maybe perhaps a simplistic slide shows how folks are kind of working on the ground together. And it's really nice because from our vantage point, it's easy to see how one kind of feeds into the other and is a very generative process. So if we start from the left and think about how HJC is helping to elevate key policy priorities, that is then taken to the Embers project and helps to further flesh out and refine what those priorities are, and then is taken into implementation by things like the Housing Innovation Fund. And once those pipeline projects are created, how do we help pave the way to make those projects easier in the long term so that it's a lot more scalable in the future? So going back to more advocacy work and helping to generate a much more sustainable life cycle of the infrastructure happening locally. And that's all the slides I have. Really excited for the conversation coming up. Thank you.
Great. Can we do one more big round of applause for all of our panelists today? Okay, we're gonna open it up to questions. I have a couple in case we need to spur any conversation. But I'm curious if any have come in virtually through Zoom, or it looks like maybe we have.
Test, test. Okay, good. Our mics
I don't want Homer Simpson to
mics
stay
are
up here.
hot.
Oh. Sorry, I don't know why Homer is gracing us continually with his presence.
That's my favorite slide, actually. So.
Would prefer that not to stay up there. But, no.
Before you futz with that, I think Brenda.
Yeah, Brenda.
There's no comments on Zoom at the moment.
No comments on Zoom. All right. Well, I can kick us off then. So Bernadette, I think you got to this fairly directly in your presentation, but I'm curious for everybody, just sort of incorporating. Clearly, there's data around the racial and equity implications of household movement and migration. And so I am just curious if we could all speak a little bit more to the work being done to address that head on.
So I can say this because I'm not with folks who have a local government connection necessarily. So there is political diversity in the Central Valley throughout the state. And another analogy I share with folks is that California is home not just to Nancy Pelosi, but also to Kevin McCarthy. And so recognizing that, you may need to leverage data to make decisions that may not be politically popular. And so that's a good lesson for advocates, for people working within local and regional governments. And so what we're hoping is that the data can be seen as something that is impartial, agnostic, not necessarily having an agenda. And the fact that for us, again, that it's coming from UC Davis, we hope can really support advocates. We did, and led by Enterprise, we did talk to city managers and affordable housing advocates and even residents. And so we're hoping that some of the policy recommendations can be supported by the data. But yeah, I mean, the data bears out that, as I've said, it's not just UC Davis, Public Policy Institute of California has said the same thing, that displacement risk is greatest in low-income communities and communities of color.
I think one thing I'll add to what Bernadette has mentioned here is that San Joaquin County is like 80%, close to 80% people of color. And so we actually intentionally named this study for our board the Community Diversity and Displacement Study. Because one thing I think that unites a lot of our electeds in San Joaquin County is how proud they are of the diversity of the region. And so, you know, when we're talking about displacement, what we're really talking about is the risk of losing the diversity of the region that everyone's so proud of. And so that's one way that we're kind of framing the issue, but also it helps that the data kind of helps back that up, because one of the key roles of like planning staff in an agency like SJCOG is we have a responsibility to provide our decision makers with information and technical data and analysis so that so that we're supporting their decision making around some of these important issues.
Yeah, I will just also kind of support what Bernadette and Christine were mentioning, is that data is a super important component of how to get this actionable. I think it's very easy for folks to, I think, conceptually agree that it's important to focus on racial equity and to uplift policies that address that. But how do we get that across institutional kind of barriers, knowing that there are decades of policy that kind of help prevent that. So having the data first and foremost to back those ideas up and those concepts up. And then also, I think for us as funders, kind of figuring out ways to be more explicit about what we can support, and being flexible to say, hey, if a nonprofit organization is wanting to be racially justice forward, how do we figure out ways to explicitly support that and make that work happen? And so I think there's a little bit of cross-sector collaboration there that needs to happen, but also for us as funders being able to carve out ways to make sure that that is kind of uplifted beyond that.
Thank you. My second question is something I think about a lot. So I wanted to really highlight work being done in Stockton and San Joaquin County, not just because I live there, though that certainly contributes, but also because I don't think the market conditions in that region are that different from a lot of other communities, right? So often when we're looking at case studies or solutions or tools, they're based in more urbanized, sort of higher market value areas. And it can be really difficult when you're trying to do work in these regions to try to just transfer those best practices over. And so I'm curious, maybe for Bernadette and Michelle, sort of what differences you have seen and sort of the solutions proposed, or the data you're able to sort of, the research you're able to pursue, and then even Christine being in sort of these mega region conversations. I mean, what are the challenges and what are the unique opportunities that maybe characterize some of these, just being in this type of market?
Do you want to start the reverse?
Yeah, let's switch the order a bit. Keep it interesting. So I'm actually really encouraged by what I am able to partner with folks on and able to observe in places like Stockton and Fresno, where there might be, it's considered lower cost in comparison to places like the Bay Area. But in communities like this, they're very, I think, embracing of different concepts and innovations in ways that I think we're so far like down the road in places like San Francisco and Oakland, where we have some of these core kind of policy in place, like right to counsel and housing trust funds and things like that, and are trying to figure out like what we can do kind of on the margins. In places like Stockton and Fresno, we are able to kind of think more foundationally and fundamentally, like what can we do kind of systemically to address those things. And because those partners are working so closely together, I think I've personally been really encouraged by the progress that's been made. The Right to Counsel program that's happening in Fresno, for instance, that's really exciting that they were able to kind of like advocate for that and make that happen. So yeah, I think those are really great examples and very encouraging.
Can you remind me what the question
Yeah,
was?
just,
I think I missed it.
you know, we work in a region that, you know, doesn't have necessarily the tax base or maybe the political support for certain interventions that are often sort of touted as the best practices, right? So just curious, in your work, what opportunities or challenges have you found sort of working in that type of market that you've been able to push for?
Yeah, okay, thanks for repeating that. So at SJCOG, I think we benefit from learning from what other regions have advanced ahead of what we're working on. And so a lot of times we look to the Bay Area and Sacramento for best practice and case studies. But being rooted in San Joaquin County also provides, at least me as a staff person, kind of a unique perspective on, you know, what are the challenges of implementing some of these best practices and case studies in the region. And so, I mean, I think it was that perspective specifically that led to the opportunity of partnering with UC Davis and Enterprise on this displacement risk mapping exercise, because what we looked at was existing methodology for assessing displacement risk and finding that what was out there wasn't really fitting the needs or addressing you know, the information gap that we had in San Joaquin County. And so I think kind of being down the road from where the Bay Area is or the Sacramento region is on housing policy, like it does give us an opportunity in San Joaquin County to learn from and adapt what's best in other regions for San Joaquin.
Yeah, so just last week I was touring around City of LA, MacArthur Park, and Koreatown, and talking about the gentrification and displacement risks that those communities are facing. LA has something like 13 city council districts, and each city council district is larger than most, if not all, of the cities in San Joaquin. Like, so just a council district. And so we're talking about scales of magnitude difference. And I just want to highlight that, you know, when you're talking to your elected officials, you know, they will just poo-poo. Like, that's one of the things let me go back. State agencies over the last 10 years, I think, have really tried to address the actual valid criticism from local government, saying just because this TOD funding or policy works in our deeply urban areas does not mean it works for the majority, not only of the geography of California, but the majority of residents of California live outside of our biggest metropolitan cities. So again, like those millions and millions and millions of residents live outside of LA and San Francisco, for example. So we need to think about what are the solutions that really work in those communities. And so a couple take-home messages. One is, of course, these communities are different, but also looking at tools that are adaptable to those particular communities. So when I brought up the inclusionary tool, of course I wanted to share that with you, but I also wanted to highlight that, you know, your community may look for a community that has a population of 50,000. That might have a very, you know, maybe there's like high fire prone or some major environmental justice issues adjacent to industrial areas. So I say that because you need to find similar communities. Similar size, honestly, is probably the biggest issue. So I think, you know, we need to keep that in mind, that communities are different, and seeking innovation in our suburban and inland communities outside of our coastal and largest urban centers is going to be really critical to making some significant progress on housing affordability.
Great, thank you. And I think we have a question came in virtually.
Yes, so the question is, what is the CZI doing as far as wealth building initiatives?
Great question.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part again?
What is CZI doing as far as wealth building initiatives?
Yeah, thank you. Really great question. So CZI has had the housing affordability team for since 2016, and we are now part of the broader community team initiative, which is really exciting because it helps us think beyond just the purview of housing affordability and really thinking about larger kind of things that are foundational to community development, community wealth building more broadly, which is really exciting because it helps address kind of those kind of higher order challenges. What we're doing in the wealth building kind of arena, I think we're still figuring out kind of officially what we're able to say, but I think broadly it's not kind of shying away from centering racial equity and making sure that we do have resources to put forth towards that. So an example of what we did last year is a $3 million fund called FAIR, which helped to work with existing grantees to explicitly uplift, for instance, racial justice healing opportunities like time off for their BIPOC staff, figuring out ways to build these themes into their mission and strategy moving forward, and work that helps to kind of think beyond what their maybe immediate day-to-day might be towards those broader goals. For wealth building, I think specifically for housing, while we haven't had the official merge yet into the community team strategy, we have been kind of approaching community wealth building in earlier years with things like our investment in Landed, which hopes to support teacher housing in places where it's really hard to afford to live near where they work, where these education workforce folks live near where they work, and so helping to support their home buying opportunities with things like supported down payment and things like that.
Oh, all right. We got some questions. So if I give you the mic, go ahead and just, if you could state your name and where you're from for folks on the chat, and I'm going to kind of make my way down.
Hi, my name's Lenny Grant. I'm an architect in San Luis Obispo, and we have a housing coalition putting together a housing summit every year. Just curious to CZI's geographic reach and if there's interest in helping areas like ours, and because we're definitely a high cost area that has these sorts of issues for sure.
Definitely. So for the housing work at CZI, we are a statewide program. So certainly things that happen within California are within our kind of interest to support. Actually, the Central Valley portfolio is our only place-based strategy currently. And so that is where we can focus kind of more locally on kind of the nonprofit organizations and grassroots organizations on the ground. There's also kind of larger tent coalition building work that we do more statewide that kind of covers the geographies that we don't get to do as much local work into currently. Great question.
Hi, my name is Katie. I'm from Mid-Penn Housing, and I am curious to see what the community impact has been on immigrant and ethnic communities that have kind of been forced to migrate out of more expensive areas, and what are ways that we as like planners and developers and people generally working on housing, how can we like keep up those community connections and make sure that's alive and well?
Don't have to think about that, and then I'll just oh no, the data lady's talking. It's okay, I'm really fun. But I'm actually really glad that you. First of all, that you're working with Mid-Penn doing great work, but I wanted to highlight that one of the things that came up in our migration study is the qualitative aspect of the research. Interviews and focus groups had originally focused on the impacts to Central Valley communities, and it became abundantly clear, and then we acted on it to have a focus group of stakeholders in the Bay Area, because that's the goal. The goal is not just, hey, you need to provide affordable housing subsidies so that people in the Central Valley, so we can have working people live in the Central Valley and have an hour-and-a-half long commute. That's not the goal. The goal is to have good housing and good jobs near each other. And so to your point, that's what we're finding. So again, anecdotally, and some of the data supports this, so I don't have the data on specific immigrants or even individual racial groups, but what we are seeing, and when I say anecdotally, this is qualitative data. This is what people are telling us. is that people do not see themselves as displaced. Like, no one forced me out, like actually half of us are Filipino up here. So I'll bring up the Filipino community. Like, well, we were living in San Francisco, but we couldn't afford to live there, so we moved to Vallejo, and we couldn't afford to live there. So my kids now can't afford to live there, so we're moving to Vacaville. And my kids can't afford to live there, so moving to Nevada. Folks don't see themselves as displaced because they may not have been evicted, but the fact is that they cannot afford to live in the same community as their families. So we see, just again, bringing up the Filipino community, families can't rely on, grandparents to help watch their children. I remember when my aunt moved out to Sacramento, where I live, and she said, are there any Filipino grocery stores here? So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, is when you don't have the critical mass of immigrant populations, you can't necessarily support the cultural serving organizations. Grocery stores is one simple example, but artistic practices, dance programs, programs that are culturally tailored for your aging senior population, because they don't all live in the same community. And so that is one of the implications that we are seeing, is that communities, and not just immigrant, but communities of color, when you can't live in multi-generational communities and you don't have the critical mass of people who can create those cultural and neighborhood serving retail that are specific to your ethnicity, that creates sort of a breakdown in these communities.
I think one insight I'll add to that is that, sorry. One insight that I'll add to that as well is San Joaquin County is like a receiving community of these residents that are moving or migrating from, the Bay Area. And while it's a very diverse place, and there's probably all of the communities and all the nations represented in San Joaquin County, I think what we will typically see is that families will still be keeping in touch, but they'll be traveling over the weekend back to going west. And so maybe historically we've seen a commute pattern in the mega region where most of the volume is happening Monday through Friday. But I think increasingly you're seeing a lot of road activity, transit activity on the weekends, and I think that really speaks to some of those cultural connections, those social fabrics that still exist, but it's the transportation networks that are, helping to maintain that connection outside of regular commute times. And so that kind of puts added pressure and emphasis on, improving some of those transportation corridors for travel throughout the week outside of peak commute times.
All right, we are unfortunately at time, though I know there are many other questions, so I think we're gonna stick around for a bit if you'd like to come talk to us one-on-one. But I, again, want to thank you all for showing up to a 9 a.m. panel, and we'll, just appreciate your presence.